Given that we are here actually inside the Beltway, and that for those of us who have been conscious the last few months, the ongoing debate has been around the reauthorization of ESCA. What I'd like to ask the panelists is if you had one thing that you could convince the folks in the Senate and the House to put into a reauthorized ESCA that would substantially move the equity agenda forward, what would it be? This is one of those times where, as a teacher, you're taught to give your students some time to think about a difficult question before they answer it.
My main issue is that I would like to see, and I blogged this a short while ago on about the role of assessments, and I just want to see a general rethinking of how we use assessment data to understand that these data are giving us signals of symptoms of underlying issues, that the assessment data are not the these are measures, kind of measures of student outcomes that indicate not just, that in fact they rarely probably indicate an institutional failure the way we perceive it in current federal policy, but they're measures that are picking up all of the types of things that have been discussed at the table here, and they ought to be used not to, for example, as in Newark, and spinning off of what Lisa was saying, not to be used to shut down schools that employ senior black teachers and serve black students, close them, replace them with charter schools that have a pipeline of new young white and Asian teachers. My doc student and I just did a paper on this and reflected on the era you were talking about, the immediate post-Brown, that we can't be using these accountability measures in the way that we're using them. That we need to use them to identify, well, might there be resource disparities? Might there be programmatic issues? Can we rethink the use of the measures? And can we also redesign how we apply them to serve as signals for the types of interventions that we might want to explore for schools, as opposed to using them as the hammer. And that's the big, I'd love to think, and I've kicked this around with colleagues at other Beltway think tanks, how to write regulations to encourage states to provide for more targeted, equitable, and adequate funding, and find ways to use federal aid somehow as a stimulus for that. But what, sadly, pessimistically, what I think you end up with there is this situation where you will have some, you'll have states just trying to game the metric to be able to qualify for the federal aid. Two, you'll have some states say, well, if getting the federal aid is contingent upon making our system fairer, then forget about it, which will then make the system even less fair than it was with the federal aid. So where do you go from there? But so if there's a practical thing, although this may be high thinking too, I'd really love to think about using our measures of student outcomes differently, so that we can actually start addressing some of the underlying issues and causes rather than just bringing down the hammer.
Are we going in line?
Yeah, if you.
I can wait. All right, I'm not allowed to wait. So I kind of, for the last 14 years, to my pleasure, because as a lawyer you have a lot of sins to make up for, has been spending a lot of time with educators. And when I think about what I see day to day in New York City, I would want two kind of new spaces. One space for a really deep exploration of improvement science in education, and one space for innovation in education. So improvement, Tony Bright, who did a lot of the work that you referred to, Lisa, on kind of what characteristics of successful schools are, and I think Organizing Schools for Success is kind of one of the most important books on education in a long time. It's research-based and really shows the 5 key characteristics that are necessary to see improvements in student achievement over time, and really makes data actionable for the practitioner, which is what I'm really interested in. Talks a lot now at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and on how do we engage frontline practitioners and principals and administrators, together with students even and their parents, in improvement activities through PDSA cycles. Really developing our hypothesis about what's best for schools and what's best for young people and testing those out. Because I think there's a lot we need to continue to learn, particularly for young people who are furthest from standards. And so I think that kind of work can be very powerful and very important, and we need to kind of figure out ways to kind of get the discipline and tools in the hands of practitioners so they can do that work more. There is an enormous amount of unlocked expertise in our teaching force, and we need to figure out how to kind of bring that to the fore. I think collaboration and addressing tough problems that schools are facing and teachers are facing together is a way to do that. The other side is that we had a brief conversation before the panel started, which Lisa said I wish we had taped, about what do we really need in innovation. And one of the things I'm interested in is middle schools. Middle schools have historically been a place where we really struggle to get students to achieve. And I would love to kind of see a set of opportunities for educators to really rethink what we need to do for young adolescents in education. Because by the time they come to high school in an area of literacy, we know three things. We're asking them to do much more complex material. We know that they are struggling with their own developmental issues, and in too many instances, the structures and schools we've created alienate them from school. So they're disengaged and angry. So how would we address that if we really wanted to create a set of new types of middle schools? My personal hypothesis is that if we simplified what we asked young people to do, to writing, reading, arithmetic by 9th grade, and mastery of one thing the student cares about, we would see a lot more growth when those young people ultimately got to 9th grade and beyond. We could focus our efforts more intensively, and then we could kind of build on the interests and engagement of a young person. But that's my hypothesis. I'd like to have lots of hypotheses out there because they're really smart people amongst teachers and principals and in communities and community groups. What would it look like to really create designated space for innovation? Those would be my two magic wand wishes.
Yeah, I love that. I didn't get to tell you before about the idea of the specialization for kids. I think my daughter, who is has never been a very school-friendly child, when she was about in 4th grade, she said they got it wrong. She said they should have graduate school for little kids so that you can focus on something you really want to do. And then when you're old, you're interested in everything. So then you can do all this stuff that you don't like to do now. The other thing, before I answer that question, I want to just say really briefly as well that whenever I talk about race, there's somebody who will maybe in the audience go away saying that I am saying that white teachers can't teach black kids. I am not saying that. I believe that all teachers, all people of all ethnicities, because there's really no difference, can teach kids, but they do have to have a knowledge base, and that's what I was suggesting, that we all need a knowledge base. And I would never want for black kids all black teachers, or for white kids all white teachers, because then you lose out on learning so much from other people, or Asian or whatever ethnicity that I want a mixture of teachers. I think that one of the things that I would like to see has been a bee in my bonnet is that there are very little feedback loops for teachers to talk about various kinds of policies. I think the Common Core may well die because it doesn't have feedback loops. Even though it has has great potential, it was set out, this is it, do it, as opposed to this is it. Let us look at, as teachers and as educators, what about it makes sense, what we may be able to do with it, send back some ideas about how it worked, how it didn't work, what we might need to change. And I don't know exactly, I will admit, I don't know enough policy to be able to say what goes into the acts, but if there's some way of creating this notion of feedback, it would be wonderful.
I guess I would start with we need some system to provide all young people access to high quality early education. It's just crazy to me that we have a system that plays catch up by design. We let students get behind, and from that point on, their engagement in the system for the most part is about having them catch up. I would also say that there needs to be some language in there that requires states have some level of maintenance of effort with a weighted formula. Because again, it's about having the resources for each of the students, and the demographics of a particular state or city is different. So there needs to be some type of weighted formula. And I would go back to the idea of this POPs, giving students a personal opportunity plan, because I do believe that, as I mentioned, even the high achievers could benefit from that. We don't have standardized students, so we can't have, you know, a standard system. There should be more student-centered, deeper learning opportunities that exist, and I believe that if the federal government through ESEA challenges states to put together a plan for deeper learning, student-centered approaches, that's the right role for the federal government. That being said, I also believe that I want to keep the hammer in ESEA, because this return, I want more flexibility for the states, but this return to states' rights, I don't think that as a country, we are mature enough on the issue of race to return to that. It works well if you're in Massachusetts. If you're in Louisiana, Alabama, not so well. So there has to still be the hammer that the Department of Education will use if it determines that states are not doing what's necessary for all students.
So there's a number of questions that are looking for the panelists' opinions on different types of schools. And let's start with one that made a reference to a New York Times in-depth look at Eva Moskowitz's Success Academy, which some of you may seen. If you haven't seen it, let's just say that Success Academy is probably the most extreme form of no excuses schools. And so the question is, do you think the type of education that takes place in these no excuses schools, and I guess the questioner kind of tipped their hands by talking about humiliating students. But do you think that type of education has a place in an equity agenda?
Okay, they're looking at me. Okay, the problem is, in my way of thinking, I've written about the notion of warm demanders who are teachers well, I'm most familiar with it in the pre-integration South, who push their kids, who the kids might define as mean, who might do something that would look like putting them down in a public setting, but that is balanced with a kind of love and support and embracing and talking to the child afterwards and saying, you are just too brilliant to let you do this. And the no excuses schools that I've seen, and I haven't seen a lot, but they seem to be focused on one side of it and not the other. They're focused on the demand part, but they're not focused on the warm part. And so, no, I don't think you can do that. It's like trying to do academic rigor without social support. You really have to, it's more like the other mothering, as some researchers have called it. You know, your mother frequently did humiliate you and put you in difficult situations, but she did it in the context of, because I love you and you are going to be your best, the best that you can be. And I'm going, and if something's bad and you start crying, I'm going to embrace you, and I'm going to get in the bed with you if I need to and stroke your head. And that's the other piece that's I think not missing, that is missing in a lot of no excuses formats.
I want to raise some related issues. One of the things that I thought was interesting in the immediate aftermath of that was how I think somebody, and I was following this on Twitter, so somebody first then characterized it as similar to zero tolerance policies, and then the people siding with Success Academies tried to differentiate the two And I thought to myself, well, the difference to me is that, and zero tolerance policies are clearly problematic from a legal standpoint in terms of due process issues, and in that they are, zero tolerance policies tend in schools to be associated with particularly severe infractions, drugs, guns on campus, things of that sort, at which point some immediate, inflexible, and severe disciplinary response is applied. And zero tolerance policies, they may be for other types of behavioral issues as well, but usually toward the severe end. But nonetheless, because they are immediate, inflexible, and severe, they tend to raise all sorts of due process concerns. What strikes me about no excuses is that we're talking about immediate, inflexible, and severe responses to any infraction. If you stood up from your desk and stepped right instead of left, or if you spoke while in line to the library or cafeteria, there is an immediate, inflexible, and severe response, certainly without the caring side of it. And oftentimes this leads to a fairly quick suspension, repeated suspensions over time, perhaps even expulsion, which at least in one due process challenge in the state of California, it was decided that the expulsion from a charter school was not an expulsion, but merely an obligatory out transfer. And therefore, a due process right was, there was no due process question, because there was no property interest to the child to maintain the placement in the charter school. And one of the things that we're seeing, so I'm making the leap here into the legal, because this is an area I've written about with charter schooling, is that the disproportionate use of these models in some settings, approaching majority use in recovery school district, right, means that we are, and the fact that these are now schools that are imposing these disciplinary practices on children, and these schools that are doing so are often organized as complex public-private type organizations. In many cases, we have students who, as the case law is playing out, are actually losing a due process right to challenge their treatment, under due process, to challenge their treatment if it may in fact also relate to a First Amendment concern. If the child who was speaking out was in fact speaking out on a particular issue or wanted to express themselves in a certain way, they don't have these opportunities to even make the legal challenge that they would under a traditional government-operated institution, at least in some cases in some states, which means then if we're going to disproportionately hoist these models on some children in some cities, we're saying that these kids just don't have the rights that the kids in the burbs have. That the kids in recovery school district may be under these models, under the governance of private providers, substantially losing legal rights, in addition to being subjected to inflexible, severe, and immediate disciplinary action as a result of almost any infraction.
And
So
teachers too.
And teachers too. We know that the teachers have significantly limited rights based on a handful of cases, be they First Amendment, due process, whatever.
Okay. Another question, also on different types of school, asks if the panelists think that schools that are segregated by race and by gender, I think specifically thinking of schools, for example, that are designed to teach black males, are a good way to advance an equity agenda, or are they a distraction?
I wouldn't necessarily call them a distraction. I would just say it's a different model. Now, would I want to see a district where all of the schools are segregated by race or segregated by gender? No, because of, there's definitely value in diversity. But for some students, that model is effective. And if it's discovered that the model is effective and very helpful, I think in the marketplace of schools, there should be that opportunity.
I mean, I would agree with that coming clean. New Visions helped start the Eagle Academies and also the Young Women's Leadership Schools in New York. And I think that the key is the connection between the student and the school and the school and the student. And as long as that's a voluntary connection, I think it's a valuable strategy to try out in a portfolio district. One of the things that I reluctantly supported when I was working on the school creation work was a school that was focused on ROTC. Now, I happen to be the biggest peacenik around, but when I spoke to a 12-year-old who said, you know what, I think I need the additional structure that a military academy might provide, I ended up voting yes, even though, you know, I would fight hard to keep that young person out of the military when they graduated, if that wasn't that young person's choice. So I think we have to have a variety of different opportunities for young people to experience an education, and then I think we have to be rigorous and transparent about what's happening in those schools to make sure that they're consistent with our values as a society, and they don't kind of cross over into what we don't want to see happen to young people. But by the same token, that they recognize the diversity of communities, the diversity of student interests, and the diversity of adults' ability to respond to those interests in ways that help those young people be prepared for adult life.
I think also, if I can also say, I think a larger challenge is the number of schools within urban settings that are predominantly black
Yeah.
or predominantly Latino, predominantly low income. And for the first time in history, Southern Education Foundation report indicates that the majority of public school students qualify for free and reduced lunch. That's a problem, because there should be, you know, more diversity in our public school system, more diversity in the classroom.
So this question asks about, I guess, what the questioner fears has happened to the idea of culturally relevant teaching, that it's often done in a glib and superficial fashion, and says, you know, how do we convince policymakers, school districts, and school leaders to invest in the professional development and the support that is really necessary to do this in a serious way?
I don't know. I've been trying. We have a program going on at Southern starting right now, and we're struggling to find funding to do it that would do the kinds of things that I'm talking about. I think perhaps as people begin to see that they're not making strides just by focusing on the rigor part, maybe that will have some influence on them. I'm not sure, but you know, it's a difficult thing to try to get into place. I agree with the questioner.
Good. So one last question, and then we'll thank our panelists. I think this is, again, a bit of a hard question. Given the history of inequity at the state level, and the historic role that the federal government has played, going back to the original ESEA and the idea of the war on poverty, should we be concerned about the parts of the current ESEA reauthorization which are giving more flexibility to states and more power to states? Will that be a source of greater inequity, or is there a possibility to get out of some of the straitjacket that we've seen from the U.S. Department of Education around programs like Race to the Top?
I think on this one, I like your hammer. I was talking about a different hammer, and I think this is one of those policy issues that requires your hammer. In that I think the federal role, one, the ESEA should, over time, there are huge inequities within states, certainly, but there also remain huge inequities across states, and there are inequities in the economic conditions across states that are in part responsible for the inequities in resources available to schools. Having the federal government kick up the resources available to target to states that have less capacity, the same way states, you know, kick in resources to districts with less capacity, would certainly be helpful, and it's really one of the only ways that we're ever going to improve the equity across states. So that's important. Now, when the federal government does that, having that run through formula programs where they have a hammer available to ensure that that funding is allocated appropriately across district schools and children within states, is absolutely necessary to ensure that there's a maintenance of effort, to ensure that there's a maintenance of equity, some kind of measure in there to that effect. So I also think it's really important that, kind of going back to my original premise, that equitable and adequate funding provides a prerequisite condition that, while I'm in favor of making resources available through the U.S. Department of Ed and state education agencies to engage in innovation, I think that, you know, making the bulk of the resources available for ensuring equitable and adequate funding, that's step one. Shifting too much into the competitive grants and away from providing the basics at a point where we're not providing the basics in a lot of places, in my view, is counterproductive, because, you know, even if you stimulate, create innovative ideas, we're not going to have the resources to keep those going in the places where they might be needed most. We've got to be able to provide that funding to the maximum extent possible through the formulas that ensure an equitable and adequate base of resources, and to make sure that states and local districts follow through on that distribution.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
I mean, I would say that, yeah, I think there are certain core values we have to ensure that exist at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. But beyond that, I think that variation is interesting as long as it's intentional. And so that if we permit states to vary with the intent of understanding or learning a different strategy, a different assessment strategy, a different way of thinking about teacher development, a different way of training and preparing teachers for complicated environments like culturally diverse schools, then I think it's valuable. I think where it's not valuable is if it's not tied to our core values that we agree on and fight about, and if it's tied to and it's not tied to a real learning agenda that can advance public education moving forward.
I think it's important that the federal government says that to states, we're going to give you the flexibility to do deeper learning, but we're going to hold you responsible for equity and excellence. How you get there, Louisiana, we're not going to allow you to set a standard for learning that is based off of your local economy. Because tourism is in New Orleans, because you need people to carry the bags and people to work in the kitchen, we're not going to let you set that as your economy. Arkansas, because Tyson's Chicken is there, we're not going to let you set that as your standard. But we're going to hold you accountable for excellence and equity, and we're going to support you in that process.
Okay. Do any of our panelists like to offer a few last words, or have you said your piece?
I always have a last word.
Okay.
I just wanted to touch on one other. I mean, one of the issues you raised is it's also how you spend it, and that's certainly the case. Money can be spent badly. There's absolutely no question about that. And New Orleans, in fact, in Recovery School District, may end up being the ultimate experiment in operational inefficiency, and we could talk at length about that another time. Transportation costs and everything associated with this model that are just silly. But a really important, that same phrase, that it matters as much how you spend it as how much you have, that has been one of the phrases that's been most often used as a basis for arguing, and therefore money doesn't matter, because if people just spent it well, then it wouldn't matter how much they have. Just play Moneyball. I mean, do people know the subtitle? Now that I've spewed it so many times in public forum, people know the subtitle of the book Moneyball? It's called The Art of Winning an Unfair Game. I always come back to the point that, maybe it's okay that baseball starts out as an unfair game in terms of payroll disparities, but I don't like to think that public education systems, education of our children, should be an unfair game.
That's right.
And the bottom line is, even though it does matter how you spend it, and it can be spent badly, if you don't have it, you can't spend it.
Indeed.
Okay. Let me thank all of our panelists, I think, for a very complete and interesting conversation, and thank you for coming.